Good evening. Hello, my name is Don Duncan. I'm the California Director of Americans for Safe Access, and thank you for joining me for our live Google Hangout, California Lawmakers, Medical Cannabis is Medicine for Real. Americans for Safe Access is the nation's leading medical cannabis patients advocacy organization, and tonight we're going to be talking about medical cannabis and how we need to talk to lawmakers about that topic. I'm just going to pause momentarily to check in with our staff in DC and make sure all is going well there. It looks like we're good to go. Okay, well, thank you again for joining us. This year in Sacramento, California lawmakers will be voting on 20 medical cannabis bills. These are bills that touch on every single aspect of medical cannabis. They touch on commercial regulations for medical cannabis. They touch on cultivation and environmental standards, concentrates of cannabis and how they're to be manufactured and the penalties. They touch on patients' rights issues like equal access to health care, retention of evidence in criminal cases, and many other aspects, taxation and so forth. And so we have a really full year. I've been doing legislative work for Americans for Safe Access since 2008 and full-time for the last 3 years. And I have never seen a legislative session like this. We've got a situation right now where there are many different approaches to medical cannabis. And so the question I have right now is, are these 20 bills that touch on every aspect of medical cannabis, are they going to be good for medical cannabis patients or bad for medical cannabis patients? And in reflecting on that, what I think is that that depends on how our lawmakers perceive medical cannabis. How do they look at this issue? Because they could be looking at this issue as an issue of regulating and controlling a drug of abuse. That's been the traditional frame for medical cannabis. But they could also be looking at this as a issue of regulating an emerging industry, a commercial commodity. That's a completely different way to look at medical cannabis in California right now. We could also be looking at regulating medical cannabis as a issue of regulating a vice like tobacco, or perhaps more appropriately like alcohol. And that's a different frame on medical cannabis. We could be looking at medical cannabis like a pharmaceutical drug, something that would be regulated through the FDA and provided through the pharmacies, and that's a completely different look at medical cannabis. Or there's a really exciting opportunity, and the one that I favor for medical cannabis, and that is that we could be looking at how to regulate medical cannabis, how to treat it, and especially for our purposes, how to talk about it like an herbal medicine. And that's a really important frame for us. And that's really the gist of what I want to talk to you tonight about, is talking to our lawmakers about medical cannabis as a genuine herbal medicine, not as a drug of abuse, not as a commercial commodity, and especially not as a vice that has to be regulated for access control and for revenue purposes. And so what we're talking about here is the frame of the conversation about medical cannabis. And so the theme of our lobby day that's coming up, our annual lobby day, this will be our 4th year in Sacramento, is medical cannabis is medicine for real. And that's the frame that I want to promote in Sacramento right now, because it's really important that our lawmakers understand and talk about, and most importantly, treat medical cannabis like medicine, like herbal medicine. This pharmaceutical model, the pharmaceutical model doesn't fit. The vice model is inappropriate. This is not just another commodity. And so we need to define that frame. And so let me talk about what a frame means before we talk about how we're going to use that. When we talk about the frame in political dialogue, what we're talking about are the words, the phrases, the sound bites, even the images that we use in our conversation about medical cannabis. That's the frame. And what the frame lets us do is it lets us define the terms of the conversation, which is so important. Our opponents in law enforcement would like to define the frame as a frame of public safety and drug of abuse and criminal justice issues. That's not our frame. Our frame is herbal medicine. And so we need to spend some time thinking about how we're going to talk about medical cannabis. That could be talking about medical cannabis in light of legalization that's impending in California, or legislation, or city and county efforts to regulate medical cannabis, but it's really important that we think consciously about this, about talking to our lawmakers about medical cannabis, not as on their terms, rather, but not talking on their terms, but talking on our terms in terms of herbal medicine. This is immediately important for us because June 14th and 15th, Americans for Safe Access is inviting Californians to come to Sacramento and to talk to lawmakers about these 20 bills. And there is so much on the table for our California Citizen Lobby Day on June 14th and 15th, coming up just next month. We're coming up, we're really close to this lobby day now, and it's going to be the biggest and the most important medical cannabis citizen lobby day in the history of California. We have these 20 bills. We have 3 bills that deal with commercial regulations and licensing of activity for medical cannabis. We have 2 bills that deal with cultivation of medical cannabis and the environmental impacts that could have. We have 3 different bills that deal with manufacturing concentrated cannabis and penalties associated with that activity. We have 4 different bills that touch on patients' rights issues. These are rights that include your equal access to healthcare services like organ transplants, and ultimately pain medication. We've got issues about sales tax for terminally ill patients. We've got issues about e-cigarettes and vaporizers and where and if you can use those. And we have issues with return of property. If your lawful medical cannabis is seized, the California legislature is debating right now how that's going to be handled and what law enforcement has to do. And so there's a lot on the table. So first of all, if you're viewing us within the Google Hangout framework or the YouTube framework, you can look at the links I posted earlier today for a link to our website to look at all of these bills. I'm not going to go through 20 bills tonight. That's way too much. But if you look at safeaccessnow.org/2015/legislation, safeaccessnow.org/2015 215_legislation, you'll find bills that deal with medical cannabis right now. There are a total of 20 of them. It's really, really overwhelming. And so we need to define our frame to talk about medical cannabis in this really, really complicated context right now. And the next big chance you're going to have to do that is at our California Citizen Lobby Day. So on June 14th, we're going to meet in Sacramento. We're going to talk the first day on June 14th on Sunday. We are going to talk about cultivation regulations and about local voter initiatives. That's because all over the state of California right now, cities and counties are banning the cultivation of medical cannabis. And this is on top of existing bans for dispensaries in cities and counties around the state. And so we need to really get in front of that trend if we're going to reverse it and do something different. It's especially important because all of the commercial regulation proposals for licensing and regulation on the state level rely on local permitting to facilitate a state license. All of the proposals on the deck right now are going to require that you obtain a local approval before getting your state license. We're going to talk a bit more about that and what that means for medical cannabis a little bit later in this broadcast. But it's really important that local jurisdictions permit and license an appropriate amount of cultivation in the state of California so that if these state licensing schemes are adopted, that we have adequate medicine for patients. That first day, we're also going to talk about using the local voter initiative process because in many cities and counties around the state of California, the elected officials are out of touch with where the people are on this issue, and they are not willing to move ahead with regulations and licensing, which may be a crucial component of any statewide regulations adopted in California. And so it's very important that voters be prepared and ready to mount a viable campaign to adopt local regulations and permitting processes in their city or in their county for medical cannabis, because that may be a prerequisite to being licensed in the state of California. Now, we're going to get back to this issue of dual licensing, local and state, later, but it's really important that you consider this, because if your city or county does not have a process for licensing medical cannabis at the local level, you really want to be at that first day of the lobby day to talk about cultivation regulations and about local initiatives so that you're ready to go home and mount a real campaign for safe access. In the last election cycle, by the way, there were as many as 17 local voter initiatives on medical cannabis that dealt with taxation and permits. And we really lost across the board. We didn't really get any of the initiatives we wanted adopted. Now, we did make some progress. We did get some initiatives adopted, but they weren't the ones we were looking for. And so it's really important that people come back to the table in 2016 at the city and county level with viable initiatives that can be adopted and campaigns that can get done. And so that's what that first day is about. The second day, we're going to go to the state capitol. After a briefing and a training, we're going to go down to the state capitol. We're going to meet with our lawmakers, and we're going to talk about these 20 bills, what they mean for patients, what they mean for providers, for loved ones, for industry workers, for doctors. And that's a really, really important conversation we need to have in California. And that's why the frame is so important, because we have to talk to people about medical cannabis in, frankly, a better way than we're doing it right now. And so before we talk about strategic messaging and framing anymore on the issue of medical cannabis, I want to relate to you a story of an experience I had earlier this year in touring the state of California. It's been a long time since I've had the chance to go up and down our state and talk to people about medical cannabis. And in February of this year, Executive Director Steph Scher and I had the opportunity to visit 6 different cities to talk to patients in those cities about medical cannabis and about commercial regulations. And we visited these cities and we talked to our members, we talked to other stakeholders, we talked to people about medical cannabis and what they wanted on a state level, what they feared on a state level, and what we were looking for in California when it comes to medical cannabis. These documents we have collected and we're going to be publishing for our lobby day as what we call the points of unity. The points of unity are points that we talked about where patients, industry, doctors, researchers all stand together to define and classify medical cannabis regulations. These are things like protecting safe access in California, protecting patient cultivation, keeping taxation low so that patients are not priced out of the medical cannabis market, and on and on. If you go to our website, americansforsafeaccess.org, you can go /points of unity with an underscore every time, and you can look at that document. It's also going to be a big part of our Citizen Lobby Day this year. And so we went up and down the state to talk to people about these points of unity, to create this document, to create this content from the bottom up, from the base, from our members, from patients, from growers, from providers, from industry workers, to find out what they wanted to see in medical cannabis regulations. And I discovered something on this tour that was surprising to me, and maybe it should not have been, but it was surprising to me. And it's this, that the conversation we're having about medical cannabis in California is about 15 years out of date. You see, way back in 1996, when we were voting on medical cannabis in California, voters adopted Proposition 215. The conversation was very different. It was simple. The conversation was more or less like this. If you're dying, you should be able to use medical cannabis. And that conversation took us to victory in November of 1996. But that is not the current conversation. Back in 1996, most of us had never heard of the endocannabinoid system. Most of us had never talked about medical cannabis in terms of wellness and living and prospering and getting better. It was about dying. And think about this for a minute. If you were to say to anybody in California then or now, if someone is dying, they should be allowed to blank, and you fill in the blank. There's almost nothing you can put in that blank that most people would object to, whether that's they should be allowed to gamble, they should be allowed to drink as much as they want, they should be allowed to park in the red zone. There's nothing you can put in the blank that people probably would not get behind. And so medical cannabis was in that space in 1996. If you're dying, go ahead and do it. But we've evolved since then. We've learned that medical cannabis and the endocannabinoid system and the therapeutic uses of cannabis are not just for dying people. It's not just a medicine of last resort. It's a medicine that can benefit millions and millions of people in California and around the country. And so we need to have a bigger and a better conversation about medical cannabis that is not just about taking sick and dying Californians off the front lines of the war on drugs. That is an important message, and we have accomplished that to a certain degree in some parts of California. But now it's time to talk about medical cannabis as healthcare, as genuine medicine. And when we start looking at this, what I realized visiting our 6 cities around the state and talking to our base and reading what's been published is that we haven't done a really great job of redefining this conversation and creating the new frame, because the frame is not about people who are dying and you feel sorry for them and so they should get medicine. The frame now for lawmakers is this: medical cannabis is medicine for real. And if it's medicine for real, it has to be treated like medicine. It has to be regulated like medicine. And early on, I talked about these different approaches to medical cannabis. Is it a drug of abuse? And so we're going to follow some treatment model and harm reduction and demand reduction model. Are we going to treat it like a commodity, just be regulated like other things that are for sale in the state? Do we treat it like a vice, like alcohol and tobacco? There's a lot of momentum. A lot of people who mean well want to treat cannabis like a vice, but it's not. It is not a vice. It's a medicine. Is it a pharmaceutical? Yeah, probably not. It's herbal medicine. It needs to be treated like herbal medicine. And we have tools in place right now to treat medical cannabis like herbal medicine. And so when we come to Sacramento in June to talk to our lawmakers, what I want to talk to you about is strategic messaging. How do we talk to our lawmakers about medical cannabis as medicine for real? Now, by the way, this conversation also matters with your city councils and your county board of supervisors who are adopting local regulations. It matters in the media. It matters in your neighborhood groups, in your Sunday school classes, anywhere that you're talking about medical cannabis as an ambassador, as a crusader for patients' rights. There is some place that you need to think about the strategic messaging. And so I'm not going to suggest tonight the ultimate strategic messaging for medical cannabis. I want us to have a conversation about strategic messaging. And what we're doing tonight is a starting point for how we're going to talk to lawmakers to change this frame from the old 1996 frame, well, these guys are dying, so we better give it to them, to the new frame that cannabis is medicine. It's herbal medicine that we use to be well, to be optimal, to treat serious symptoms, and in those tragic cases, we use it because we're sick and we're dying. And so that's the new frame of this. And so I want you to be empowered and to start that conversation and keep having it, starting now, going through the lobby day, and then bringing that home to your city and your county and your loved ones in your community about how to talk about medical cannabis. And so here's the thing about strategic messaging. Strategic messaging is how you talk to people you need to convince. And so the first thing you need to know about strategic messaging is that this is a message you're developing for someone besides you. Strategic messaging is not for you. It's very easy for us as advocates who are passionate about the issue to get lost in what we believe is right and what we believe is important. And so you have to step out of yourself to think about strategic messaging and think about what it is that the people you want to convince need to hear. They need to know about medical cannabis, because I have very passionate beliefs about medical cannabis, because there are people I love who need that medicine. But that may not be the message I need to take to lawmakers. And so the first thing you have to do is step back from your personal experience and decide, who is it that I am going to talk to? Now, that could be your Sunday school class. That could be your family. That could be the local news media, the city council. But in our context of this conversation, that's lawmakers in Sacramento. And lawmakers in Sacramento may or may not be persuaded by the thing that's most important to you. I would love to go to lawmakers and say, listen, someone I love, people that I care deeply about, need medical cannabis. They're suffering without it. Their lives are better when they have it. And please, will you write these laws? Will you adopt amendments and ordinances and bills that protect the people I care about? But that might not tug the heartstrings or rise to the level of priority for a lawmaker. So the first thing you want to think about in strategic messaging is, who is your audience and what matters to your audience? And that's where you start with strategic messaging. And so I want to suggest some things that might be strategic messages that are important for people who are elected officials. Primarily right now, I'm talking about state lawmakers, because that's the next thing that's on our agenda. But this is also significant for your city council members and your board of supervisors who may be writing regulations that affect safe access in your community. And the first thing that they need to know is this. Number one, medical cannabis helps a lot of people in California. There are a lot of people using it. A study published last year in the journal Drug and Alcohol Review indicated that about 5% of the people in California, that's about 1.5 million, have used medical cannabis. That's a lot of people. That's a huge percentage. And at 5% for medical cannabis use, we're really talking about a big, important constituency in the state of California. And so the first thing I would suggest that people need to know, lawmakers need to know primarily, is that, number one, a lot of people are using this medicine. So it's not a fringe issue. This is not about drug culture. This is not about hippies. This is not about potheads or alternative people. This is about mainstream California. 5%, 1.5 million Californians have used medical cannabis. And I will be willing to bet that number reflected in the survey is actually a little low statistically. I feel like maybe it's higher. But the best science we have right now says 1.5 million. Number two, these people who are using medical cannabis are getting real relief from serious medical conditions. I think sometimes we fall into the trap of thinking that that message is passé. That, oh, of course, cannabis is medicine and it helps people. But it's not. We need to keep that at the forefront of our frame because it's really important to keep in mind of lawmakers and others that cannabis is medicine that helps people, because we don't want to go down that path of a vice or of a commodity or any of these other paths that don't lead us to our ultimate goal, which is safe access for everyone who needs it. And so we have to keep telling our lawmakers, number two, that cannabis provides real relief for people suffering from serious conditions. Our opponents, their frame is this: anybody can get a medical marijuana recommendation. And to whatever degree that's true, we could debate on and on. But the fact is this: real people in California, a lot of them are getting real relief. And in the same study conducted, the first ever representative sample of Californians surveyed about medical cannabis showed two things. One is that a lot of people are using cannabis, as we discussed. But number two is that they are getting real relief, significant relief, for serious medical conditions. 92% of the people surveyed in this study that was published last year indicated that they were getting real relief from a serious condition. The top three conditions, by the way, are chronic pain, arthritis, and cancer. Also near the top was HIV and AIDS. Symptoms for these conditions are very, very serious, and they're conditions for which conventional medicine has very few successful options. So when we're talking about chronic pain, arthritis, and cancer, we're really talking about conditions that people are struggling with in the conventional model. And so it's no surprise that these are the top conditions for which people report serious relief, 92%. Now, I don't know of any pharmaceutical drug in my layman's research around medical cannabis and healthcare. 92%, no drug has that approval rating. There's no drug of which I know where users report at 92% that they're getting significant relief from their serious medical condition. And so these two things are really important that we keep at the very, very front of this debate. A lot of people use medical cannabis and they get real relief from serious conditions. If we can get those two things back to the forefront of the conversation about medical cannabis, we will have scored a huge, huge victory. The next frame I'd like to suggest, the next strategic message that I would like to suggest for medical cannabis is this: medical cannabis should be regulated and treated like a medicine. There are ways already in this society that we treat medical cannabis, that we treat herbal medicine rather. And so it's very, very, very important that we treat medical cannabis like we treat other herbal medicines. It is not a vice. It is not, strictly speaking, an intoxicant, or at least it is not just an intoxicant. It's an herbal medicine. And so we need lawmakers to have that in their mind, because they may be seduced by extreme projections of tax revenue. They may be persuaded by law enforcement arguments that medical cannabis is a dangerous drug and we have to protect the public. And what they need to remember is that medical cannabis is an herbal medicine and it should be treated and regulated as such. Number four, I want us to think about the fact that the pharmaceutical approach to medical cannabis is very limited in its application, and in fact may ultimately be inappropriate. You see, whole plant medicine like medical cannabis doesn't really work like pharmaceutical drugs. Pharmaceutical drugs that are approved through the FDA and available in pharmacies are by and large single substance compounds. they can go through this process of clinical trials with a double-blind study, so neither the researchers or the participants know if they're getting a placebo or the real thing. And clever doctors and researchers have figured out how to do that with single substance compounds. But it doesn't work with whole plant medicine. Herbal medicine, like medical cannabis, is subtle, it's changeable, it relies on a feedback between the user and the doctor, we need that input and that trial and error, and we're not going to be able to regulate medical cannabis as a whole plant medicine through that pharmaceutical model. Now, I do want to say this. There are some substances in cannabis that could be isolated in a laboratory and provided as a single substance compound through the normal pharmaceutical FDA-approved process. And if those medicines help people, that's great. I want every medicine that helps people to be available on the market in around the world, because that is what's good for people. But those pharmaceutical approaches, those single substance compounds, those FDA-approved medicines must never replace whole plant medicine. And so that's a line we have to draw in the sand and let our representatives know that pharmaceutical model does not work for medical cannabis. It's inappropriate. We're talking here about a square peg and a round hole, and that we need this medicine regulated like herbal medicine. Number 5, we already have protocols for regulating herbal medicine in the United States. We don't have to redefine this. We don't have to reinvent the wheel. So often when I meet with lawmakers on the city or the county or even in Washington, D.C. or the state, they tell me, we can't do it. We don't know what to do. We don't know how to regulate medical marijuana. And the good news is we do. We do know how to regulate medical marijuana. We know how to regulate medical cannabis because those protocols have already been published. And here's what happened. A few years ago, Americans for Safe Access and the American Herbal Products Association got together to convene committees of experts from the medical cannabis industry to talk about it. The American Herbal Products Association is, I guess for lack of a better description, they are the ASA of herbal products. They are the group that is advocating for self-regulation, for proper regulation of herbal products, including herbal medicines, and they're the ones who have kept the FDA off of herbal medicines for decades. These guys are the voice of the herbal products industry in the United States, and they convened these committees, and they published, just finishing up this year, protocols. We have existing protocols for the manufacturing, the cultivation, the processing, the dispensing, and the testing of medical cannabis. They're already published, and so we've really done this work for lawmakers already. And so lawmakers need to understand, as part of our frame and our strategic message, that we do already know experts, regulatory experts, experts in cultivation, experts in manufacturing and dispensing and testing, have already developed the protocols that we need to regulate medical cannabis in California and, in fact, around the country. And so if we can get messages like these to our lawmakers, those are going to be the ones that are going to carry the day and get us to the place we need to be with these 20 bills. Let me just recap really quickly about the strategic messaging that could be part of the frame that makes a difference. A lot of Californians use medical cannabis, 1.5 million, which again I think is a conservative estimate. Number 2, these people are reporting overwhelmingly, 92%, that they get real relief from serious medical conditions. The top 3 again are chronic pain, arthritis, and cancer. Number 3, medicine should not be regulated like a vice, like alcohol and tobacco. It should be regulated like medicine. Number 4, the pharmaceutical approach is probably not appropriate. In fact, is indeed not appropriate for whole plant medicine, for medical cannabis. And number 5, we already have the protocols in place to deal with medical cannabis and to regulate it as medicine in California. And those protocols are applicable at both the state, county and local level. And so we don't have to go about and figure out how to do this. Very smart people who already know about regulating herbal medicine have done it already. And so that's the kind of strategic messaging that we need to be taking to lawmakers. I know there are many, many more messages that people have and want to say. And I want to talk about the people I love. Other people want to talk about hemp and its environmental benefits. Other people have numerous other issues that they want to bring up. But you have to think about your audience. And those are the kinds of messages that are appropriate for lawmakers. Other kinds of messages will be appropriate for other people. And so I really want to encourage our community between now and June 15th, when we descend en masse on the California State Capitol to talk about these bills, to think about what the strategic message that your state assembly member and your state senator need to hear when it comes to medical cannabis. And that's how we're going to be most effective in talking to our lawmakers. Now, I see we're about at the halfway point of this broadcast. I've been talking a lot, so I want to remind you that if you're joining me on the Google platform, if you're part of the Google Hangout, that there's a comment feature included. So click on that box, and you can write in questions or comments that I will share with the group. So you can start sending those in now. If you're joining us on YouTube, you don't have that feature. I'm sorry to say you're watching a live broadcast, but there's no interactive feature. So if you have something you want to share on YouTube, you can just add a comment, and people can look at that and read it and respond to it later on. Now, we're at about the halfway point. Before we talk more about Lobby Day and the rest of that, I want to talk about some pitfalls in strategic messaging, because even though we've come a long, long way in medical cannabis about how we talk about this issue, there are some pitfalls. And I think when we're dealing with the regulatory issue and our messaging, we need to be aware of some of these things. I've listed 4 of them. There are probably many, many more. One thing that I think we have to be aware of is over-regulation. Now, there are many people in California, the phrase I hear a lot, and frankly I like, is this: we should regulate cannabis like tomatoes. And that's awesome. And I do get it, and I understand where people are going. But we're not really ready to go from Schedule 1 on the Controlled Substances Act to tomatoes. There's a practical, stepwise process between Schedule 1 and tomatoes. However, we have to be aware of overregulation. Regulation at the legislative level, where there are 120 lawmakers who represent California and adopt our laws, they really aren't good at minutia. They're not good at details. And so I think we need to be in support of and aware of bills and supporting bills that allow for experts, regulators, and constituents to deal with the minutia, the tiny details of regulation. So we need to set up the broad framework and not try to micromanage medical cannabis in the state of California. Number 2, we need to be very careful about the pitfall of setting the barrier to entry into the medical cannabis industry, because it is an emerging industry in California, and we need to be careful about setting that barrier too high. In every regulated industry, there is a barrier to entry that is financial, because regulations are expensive, and you have to comply, and you have to conform, and you have to come up to contemporary standards for safety and commercial activity and retail sales and manufacturing. And so there will be a barrier to entry. The question is how high. And here in California, we're lucky because our state law and constitution prohibit the state from assessing fees that are in excess of what's necessary to provide services. Nevertheless, we have to watch out for proposals that will make the regulation of medical cannabis much too expensive for the majority of people in the industry to participate in any real way. And so that's the second pitfall, is this sort of high financial barrier to entry. The third thing that's really complicated for us has to do with local bans on providing medical cannabis and on cultivating medical cannabis. And this is a really tricky topic. In political terms, we call this state preemption versus local control. The question about whether or not the state can license commercial medical cannabis activity and trump a local ban or on distribution or cultivation. And that is a very controversial issue. And I want to say right up front on point number 3 is this, that I would prefer a system in California where the state mandated access to every community in the state, and local governments did not have the option to ban medical cannabis. Unfortunately, that is a battle that brave people, including Americans for Safe Access and others, fought, and frankly, we did not prevail. The California Supreme Court ruled in the Riverside decision, Riverside versus Inland Empire Patients Group, that nothing in the state law prevented a city or county from banning medical marijuana dispensaries. Other cases are working their way through the process. They're not finally adjudicated yet, but there are other cases that deal with the cultivation of medical cannabis. And the fact is this: even though I strongly prefer no local bans and state law that preempts local bans, it may not be on the table. Last year, we talked to our champions in the state legislature, people who always stand up for us, who always push the envelope on medical cannabis, and tried to push back on this issue of local bans. Not one single lawmaker, no one in the state legislature last year would stand up to cities and counties and propose an amendment or a bill that would stop them from banning medical cannabis. And so we may, for the time being, be faced with a landscape where cities and counties have the authority to ban dispensaries and possibly cultivation of medical cannabis. Now, we need to fight that as hard as we can in the courts, but we also need to be pragmatic about where we are politically in the state of California right now. And so in our potential pitfalls for state regulation, we need to be very, very aware of local issues. Whatever bill that is going to be adopted in California to regulate medical cannabis needs to be as accommodating as is politically possible in the state of California to the idea of state licensing in jurisdictions that approve of dispensing and cultivation or perhaps do not specifically ban it. And this is a tough road for us to go down because what we want right now, we can't have right now. We might have it later, but on a political perspective, we can't necessarily have it right now. And so I want to encourage folks to be pragmatic in this. So we've talked about overregulation, dealing with the minutiae. We've talked about high financial barriers to entering the industry. We've talked about local bans and doing the best we can to either prevent local bans from stopping a state licensing scheme or perhaps providing a path forward where there is a barrier. And then number four has to do with flexibility. Whatever state licensing scheme we adopt for commercial activity medical cannabis, there has to be some built-in flexibility into it because things are going to change. And that's where we'll be concluding our comments tonight, is what's going to change moving into 2016. As a concrete example of this issue of flexibility, one of the issues about commercial licensing has to do with suitability, or who can obtain a license to cultivate, process, distribute, or test medical cannabis. And a ubiquitous proposal right now, a pitfall we're seeing under state law, is this idea that people with felony convictions can't get licenses. And that's a really backward approach to medical cannabis because some people, acting in all good faith up until now, wound up with federal convictions, felony convictions, because they were trying to do right, but the laws weren't there yet. And so we need flexibility. And flexibility in that situation is important. It's also important in numbers of dispensary, location, local preemption. Flexibility is really important. And so we should be looking for instances where laws are too inflexible and opportunities to make them more flexible, perhaps by empowering a regulatory body with discretion in certain situations to make appropriate choices to see to it that medicine gets to people. So to recap on those pitfalls, we've got onerous regulations that are too restrictive, that really go too far in regulating medical cannabis. Number two, a financial burden that is too high to get into the medical cannabis industry. Number three, issues around local preemption and facilitating access in cities and counties that have not yet regulated or banned medical cannabis. And number four, a lack of flexibility. And so we really need to look out for those issues when we're talking to lawmakers, because those are going to be problems that are going to come up in every single one of the regulatory bills. So if you're looking for more information in terms of strategic messaging and finding your voice in this regard, I want to encourage you to look at our online Advocates Training Center. There's a video, a workbook, and a worksheet up there about finding your voice, developing your strategic messages, identifying your audience, and the other really important things that need to happen to be an effective advocate. And again, I'm talking about the state legislature right now, but this applies in your city and your county as well. And so I really want to encourage folks to look at that and to think very consciously between now and the time that you get to the state capitol on June 15th about what your message to lawmakers is. And again, there are many, many, many bills on the table. And so these bills touch on almost every aspect of medical cannabis, and so whatever your personal priority is, you're going to have a chance to talk to your lawmakers. I will let you know this about what's going to happen on June 15th. We're going to have the workshops, of course, on June 14th. But on June 15th, when you come to the lobby day and you participate in this, we're going to give you fact sheets. Fact sheets are usually 1 or 2 page summaries of bills. But we're going to change up this process this year because all of these bills are a work in progress. And our lobby day is happening very early in the legislative process. We're going to be in June. This thing goes until the end of August. And so we're going to give you a fact sheet to talk about the bill, to perhaps suggest some of the amendments we think are good, but we're also going to have a place in that fact sheet for your personal input on the bill. And so while we as a group are making a showing of strength for medical cannabis in California that day, with hundreds of people in the halls of the Capitol, you individually are talking to your assembly member and your state senator, and we're going to make a place for your individual voice about your priorities and your message. And so that's why I really want to encourage people to think in advance about what you want to say to the people who are going to cast their vote on your behalf, because it's really, really important that they hear from constituents. If you follow my emails and my blog, you've heard me say many, many times about the influence of grassroots activists above paid lobbyists. Actual research conducted by the Congressional Management Foundation finds that your in-person visit with a lawmaker, and to a lesser degree your in-person phone calls and individual letters and emails to lawmakers, are 6 times more influential for undecided lawmakers than are the visits of paid lobbyists. And so you really do hold the power here, and that's awesome. And so I want you to remember that your message does matter. I know sometimes in the moment of time it may seem like it doesn't work. We don't get the amendments we want sometimes. Bills die. Bad bills are adopted. Bad amendments are adopted. But on the long term, your individual input does matter. And that's why we're making a specific space for all 300 of our citizen lobbyists to have their own personal opinion and input on these bills. And so I hope that you're going to use this conscious and intentional thought about strategic messaging to frame your message to be a part of that. Now, I also know not every single one of you are coming to Sacramento on the 14th and the 15th of June, and that's okay. There's going to be a call-in day, and we're also going to have an opportunity in advance for you to send written comments. And so I want to encourage everybody, whether you can get here or not, to be a part of that lobby day, either in person here in Sacramento or from wherever you are in California, to talk to your lawmakers. Remember, you have 2 people that you urgently need to reach and over whom you have the most influence. It's your state assembly member and your state senator, and you can influence those people. And so I really, really want to encourage you to participate that and do it. If you haven't done it already, please go to californiacitizenlobbyday.org, californiacitizenlobbyday.org, and get signed up. When you sign up, I'm going to make an appointment for you with your state assembly member and senator or their staff to talk about these bills. And so you're going to have that face-to-face time that is really, really the gold standard in grassroots democracy. And so I hope you'll be a part of that, because when you walk out of those offices, you make those visits, you say your piece, and you walk out, I promise you this, you'll make a difference, and you're going to feel 10 feet tall. I'm going to wrap up tonight with one additional thought and an anecdote. And first, an anecdote. Last year, we brought about 200 people or so to the state capitol. I'm shooting for 300 this year, but we brought out 200 people, and 2 women went to visit their state assembly member from Marin County. They went to visit a man named Mark Levine, and they dropped off a fact sheet for Americans for Safe Access about the need to protect legal medical cannabis patients who use medical cannabis and need an organ transplant. If you don't know already, people who use medical cannabis are routinely denied a place on the National Organ Transplant wait list, and if they're on the wait list, they can be dropped off the wait list if they test positive for cannabis use, even legal medical cannabis use. These policies predate Proposition 215. And so we had a member at Americans for Safe Access, Mr. Norman Smith, who died because he was dropped off the organ transplant wait list. And so we've been trying for 2 years to get a bill introduced that will protect legal patients from being dropped off the organ transplant list if they're using legal medical cannabis. And these 2 women went to meet with Mark Levine, and they sat down with his staff. He was not available at the time, but they sat down with staff. And by the way, staff are awesome. They make the whole world go in Sacramento. And they talked about the need, and they left the fact sheet, and we didn't hear a word for months. Months passed, the legislative session ended, And in January of this year, Mark Levine's office called me and said, hey, we got this fact sheet. 2 of our people came in. They live in the district. What's this all about? And that's why we have today a bill authored by Assemblymember Mark Levine to protect medical cannabis patients and stop discrimination in the organ transplant process. That is grassroots power in action. And you can do that. You can do that at the Citizen Lobby Day. And so we're going to talk about the regulatory bills, about commercial regulations, and about cultivation and concentrates and patients' rights that are on the table right now. But we're also going to be talking about next year, because we have unfinished work of medical cannabis in California. We have employment discrimination. We have patients denied opiate medicines that they need because they use medical cannabis. We have patients denied housing. They can't smoke or cultivate in their housing. And we have parents who are denied custodial rights and parental rights because of their medical cannabis use. I was just on the phone just today with a parent who's facing a custody challenge because of his medical cannabis use. And so we have this unfinished business to do, and we need to get on it. And one of the important things we're going to do on June 15th at the Citizen Lobby Day is plant the seeds for next year for patients' rights in California, because we have to finish that work. It doesn't matter if we have a well-regulated and well-oiled machine for the medical cannabis industry. That's one thing, but we need to protect the rights of the consumers who are using that medical cannabis. And so you have an important role to play with that. And by the way, no one's going to do that work if you don't. That is work that advocates and activists and people who just believe in medical cannabis have to do. And one final thought in terms of outside of that story of grassroots success, and it's this. The clock is ticking on 2016. We are getting really close. I think 4 voter initiatives have already been introduced. We know there are more coming. We don't know who's going to get on the ballot. We don't know what's going to happen moving into 2016. But I would say this, it's a pretty safe bet right now that someone is going to make it to the ballot in November of 2016. And voters are going to vote on legalizing cannabis for non-medical use. I don't know which proposal will make it. I don't know what the details are going to be. But I know this. As we move to 2016, if we don't have a regulated system for medical cannabis, there's a great risk of unintended consequences, the kind we've seen in the state of Washington and Oregon for medical cannabis patients, where rights roll back, not because anybody's being a bad guy and wants to take away medical rights, but because as these legalization initiatives come online and are implemented, there's always a chance for unintended consequences. And so we need a well-regulated program like they had in Colorado when they legalized recreational marijuana. They already had their medical program in place, and it's done just fine. And so we need to be on that. But I also want to caution you that if you believe in legalization and you're passionate about it, a worst-case scenario for opposition to a 2016 legalization initiative is for opponents to point at the medical program and say, look, we can't even figure out medical marijuana. How can we possibly legalize? And so in the past, people have told us about Sacramento and about California, don't worry, we'll get it next year. We'll handle this next year. I believe right now we are out of next year's. We need to pass a regulation bill for commercial medical cannabis activity right now in Sacramento, because moving into 2016, we need clarity on what the boundaries are for medical cannabis, what the process is, what's permissible, so that the people who are going to write those initiatives know what the ground rules are for medical cannabis, and so that voters get it, that medical cannabis is properly regulated, and it's okay if they believe in legalization to move on to that other issue, because the worst case scenario would be for medical cannabis to be a stumbling block on the way to a broader reform that keeps people out of jail for cannabis use. And so I really want to encourage folks to get behind this process this year to adopt something to license and regulate medical cannabis. We're really late in the game. And I will also say, as I've said many times before, in doing that, we have to be pragmatic. We're going to create our strategic messages. We're going to frame the issue to the best of our ability, and then we're going to take that to the state legislature, and we have to be pragmatic. We may not get everything we want. I don't think we can overturn local bans in the state capital this year, but we can get something this year, and we can take a beachhead, and we can make progress. And so I really, really want to encourage you to be a part of that and to be practical and to be reasonable and to stay plugged in. I know that political processes are sometimes unpleasant for people. That is the nature of the beast. But I want to encourage you to be as plugged in about that as possible, because we can make a difference in California. We've seen that. And so that really concludes my prepared comments for tonight. I want to encourage everyone, again, to go to californiacitizenlobbyday.org, get signed up. The earlier I request your appointment with your lawmaker, the more likely you are to get a face-to-face with your representative. Get signed up at californiacitizenlobbyday.org. And I also want to encourage you to start thinking about what it is you want to say. And again, if you can't make it to Sacramento, there will be an opportunity for you to participate on the telephone and by email in the California Citizen Lobby Day. And so we could have hundreds of people around the state speaking up that day about medical cannabis and making a real impact for us. So I want to thank you for your attention tonight. I know I've been going on a long time, so thanks for being patient with this. I want to encourage you to come back again. Keep your eye on the email list. 2 weeks from now, we're going to do another live broadcast, and we're going to talk, by that point, I think, about some of the minutia of the regulatory bills that are on the table, and we're also going to talk about the local efforts to regulate medical cannabis at the city and county level, which are going to be crucial, I believe, to the state licensing and regulatory program. So stay plugged in with this. Keep participating. If you're not on our email discussion list, go to the our website, go at Safe Access or AmericansForSafeAccess.org or SafeAccessNow.org, and get signed up on our email list for California so that you can be a part of that conversation. Get registered, get signed up, and stay plugged in. Thanks again for participating tonight, and I will look forward to talking to you again when we have the next live Google Hangout and broadcast right here on your computer, coming up 2 weeks from tonight. If you're not getting my emails, that's where you're going to get the link and the information. So thanks a lot. You guys have a great night, and I will look forward to seeing you in Sacramento very, very soon.